Our next up is Dr. Martin Cipollini, Dana Professor of Biology at Berry College. Dr. Cipollini has directed various mountain longleaf pine projects since 2001 and the Georgia chapter of the American Chestnut Foundation Science Program since 2006. You're up, Dr. Cipollini.
Thank you, Frank. Appreciate it. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Hopefully be able to see this. Okay, so I guess the talk that I'm going to give today really relates to one of the reasons why we use prescribed burning, and this is actually in restoration of habitats. The particular habitat that I'm going to be talking about is mountain longleaf pine forest, specifically on Berry College. I'll be using some other sites as comparative sites, but and this may differ from some sort of typical forestry kind of things. This is really forest ecology, forest restoration ecology. So bear with me as I maybe show some data and some units that maybe some of you aren't usually using, like, you know, hectares and that sort of thing. So Berry College is a small undergraduate institution, right? But we have a very interesting habitat on campus. We have one of the largest campus, or if not the largest campus in the world. This habitat, once again, is referred to as mountain or montane longleaf pine. As you should all know, I hope, most longleaf is located in the coastal plain, particularly in Georgia, but we have this sort of little tongue of longleaf pine that sort of licks up into the mountain regions in northeast Alabama and northwest Georgia. So the main study sites that I'm going to be talking about today are the longleaf that are on Berry's Lavender Mountain. Before I even get into any of the deep, yes?
Please share your screen with the audience, please.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm going to have to back up. I thought I was sharing the screen. Hang on. Sorry about that. All right. I should know this. I've been teaching by Zoom for, you know, the last 3 months, so I didn't know how to do that. Sorry about that, folks.
Not a problem. We're good to go now.
Let me get back. Let me get back here. So I was just giving you some general background. So, you know, the slides don't necessarily need to be seen for that. But so as I was getting into the idea that we're talking about mountain longleaf pine habitat, and an important thing to recognize about the habitats at Berry College is that they were fire suppressed for many decades, probably 60 to 70 years of fire suppression before we started to try to reintroduce prescribed burning into these stands. And that represents some pretty unique challenges. And again, some of you are very accustomed to this kind of challenge. All right. So for those of you that aren't quite familiar, I guess we have a lot of people from a lot of other locations on this in this conference. Most longleaf pine is found throughout the coastal plain and down into the panhandle and the center of Florida, these pockets out in Texas. But the habitats that we're talking about here are right here up in northeast Alabama, northwest Georgia. And this little notation, this is one of Moore's maps, has a notation indicating the board feet yield. And I want you to recognize that the board feet yield expected throughout the coastal plain is equaled in some of these pockets in northeast Alabama and northwest Georgia. So these were not insignificant longleaf pine habitats. Now the context is, again, Berry College, a small liberal arts college. We consider this the world's largest college campus, it's a contiguous campus. And we also think of it as our 27,000 acre outdoor laboratory because we're capable of using a lot of these forested lands as well as the farms and other habitats that we have on campus in education and research. So it's a pretty unique situation to be able to do these kinds of things. And a lot of the work that I do has been done with undergraduate students. Starting in about the very late 1990s, early 2000s, we came up with the idea of establishing a management plan for these trees that we had noticed on the campus. So the first question is, why would you develop a management plan? Why would you do anything here? And first is it relates to these old accounts and the old trees. We have trees that were dating to be over 300 years old from core samples. And these historical counts and maps suggesting a widespread longleaf forest on Lavender Mountain. And there's residual pockets of relic trees all along the south coast or south facing slopes of Lavender Mountain. As I said, burning had been restricted for decades in some of these habitats, and that resulted in a lot of hardwood encroachment, a lot of fuel buildup, near total loss of the understory, actually. Very little longleaf recruitment since about the 1930s. The population of longleaf is in decline. But on the flip side, sort of the positive or opportunity side, is most of that mountain was never plowed, so that we thought that we might be able to gain recovery of a historical understory plant community without much additional work besides prescribed burning and some stand thinning. Right. Another opportunity is that southern pine beetle wildfires were problems with pine plantations on campus, and longleaf has some advantages with respect to southern pine beetle and also with respect to wildfires, where they're actually generally resistant, right? So this is just a couple of shots of the kind of thing we were facing whenever we started this. And Shan is on this call. She helped with our first prescribed burn. This is where we lit the first prescribed burn. This is right near a historical structure called the Old Mill. And you can see substantial litter and duff buildup. This is the aftermath of a small wildfire that ashed the duff around the trees and ultimately killed the trees. Lots of hardwood encroachment, near total loss of understory, lots of fuel buildup. So our management goals were pretty general, except for one sort of specific outcome I'll talk about here at the bottom. Basically, this is, we want to have an open canopied longleaf pine dominated forest. We wanted to reduce the litter, duff, and woody fuels and increase the abundance and diversity of understory herbs and grasses. Obviously, we wanted to have that positive influence on fauna as well. In terms of a target, though, we wanted to sort of emulate the vegetation composition, trees, as well as fuel structure of frequently burned old growth mountain longleaf pine forest. And there are only a couple of spots of this in existence. And our main reference locations are the Mount Longleaf Pine National Refuge in Alabama, where burning has been ongoing for decades as a result of its former use as a military installation. What have we been doing? Well, starting in about 2003, we began restoring a burning regime, and the plan was for a 3 to 5 year return interval. In 2005, we began controlling hardwoods primarily via herbicide application. There's a little bit of control obtained of existing hardwoods through burning, but not enough. And so we began controlling hardwoods using arsenal application. I'll show some of that. Along the way, we've been following this research, education, and outreach, and a lot of help from our own group as well as outside groups. A lot of advice through the very Longleaf network that I have sort of established, and then our interagency burn team helped us establish the first prescribed burns. So a lot of little partners, and there you are, Shan, right there. Okay, Shan, one of the first members of the interagency burn team that assisted with our first prescribed burn on campus. But a lot of help with students and other groups, and our own forestry and land resources department. Now, what I'm going to talk about today mostly involves this, what we call a core management area, where these are where we have a pocket of existing relict longleaf pine trees. We also been doing some other things I'm not going to talk much about today, but we have planted and we have several different parcels on the outside. Altogether, we're talking about approximately 400 acres of managed areas on the southern slopes for the most part of Lavender Mountain. The prescribed burning involves about 60 hectares. What I'm going to talk about today is restoration burns done in old growth areas, and some of the things we've needed to do to inhibit the duff smoldering is to rake around trees, and that has been pretty effective. I'm going to show you some data showing that we've been able to retain much of our existing longleaf pine canopy. All right. The hack and squirt methods of direct hardwood control, we did this only to trees beneath non-fire tolerant hardwoods lower than 14 inches in diameter was targeted, and one squirt per 3-inch diameter, I think it is, and a lot of students able to help us with that. So we did a lot of work. It's about 25 hectares of that. So I'm going to just show you, this is approximately a decade of change in one of the stands, just to give you an idea of what we're talking about. Here's an existing longleaf pine canopy of relic trees. This is encroaching hardwoods, right? And by about 10 years into this, we have eliminated essentially that mid-story hardwood mid-story, begun the establishment of an herbaceous understory, and yet retained a good percentage of these canopy trees. So this is the kind of data that I'm going to be talking about here in detail, I guess. So I'm going to first talk about changes in the tree community. And the changes that I'm going to talk about are going to basically run the span from 2004 to 2014. Now, for various reasons, we haven't been able to burn for a few years, but we're going to get back to it very soon. I certainly hope so. So this sort of represents the early stages of restoration in this forest. We did the tree community sampling using point-centered quarter, and we're basically calculating density, cover, and frequency. And then we come up with an importance value. Some of you may be familiar with Forrester's importance value, but this is just an index that combines relative density, relative color, and relative frequency. So the more important a tree, they're high density, high cover, and high frequency species. So this is calculated for each species within each stand. Now, where do we do this work? This can maybe take a little bit of time, but these slopes are divided up into south-facing slopes that have residual longleaf on them, southwest face basically, and then northeast-facing slopes that are primarily hardwood, although there are some longleaf scattered in those northeast-facing slopes. So the designators that I'm going to have you pay attention to are HSB or HB. This is the herbicided and burned plots. Anything with a B in it has been burned, all right? Anything that's unmanaged has not been burned, and nothing has been done to, right? And then the H corresponds to herbiciding. So there are certain sets of plots that are herbicided and burned, a single plot that was herbicided and not burned, and then a number of longleaf plots that are unmanaged, just reference plots. And then coupled with that are these hardwood slopes that are also unmanaged. There's 3 unmanaged hardwood slopes, and then a burned hardwood slope, 2 burned hardwood slopes. So this is not exactly, an ideal experimental setup. This is sort of makes it some difficulty statistically, but this is the way it happened to be. The reason for the burning all in one location here is that this is one burn unit right here. This area right here is a single burn unit. There's another burn unit over here that we're not including in this study, but these are all unburned areas. These are burned areas. So our reference site, we got some data for comparison. So data got from Varner et al., 2003. This is the Cappy Hill and Red-tailed Ridges locations in Mount Longleaf Pine National Wildlife Refuge. Some students visiting with me. Some other Talladega National Forest sites, though, we included some data from Horn Mountain. This is a fire-suppressed longleaf site, all right? And then another sort of special site was Common Lake RCW project. And this is where they did some substantial thinning of an existing loblolly with some residual longleaf, heavily thinned to RCW type densities and then burned frequently. And it's gradually, ultimately going to convert over to longleaf over a long period of time. But this is a habitat that is sort of high intensity management to very quickly change the structure of that community towards something approximating a frequently burned longleaf pine habitat. So here's some data then. Again, I'm just going to orient you here. These are longleaf stands that have been herbicided and burned, longleaf stands that have been unmanaged, hardwood stands that have been burned, hardwood stands that have been unmanaged, and then this one stand that was herbicided is a longleaf stand that was only herbicided. We have the various tree species here. As you can see, Quercus prinus in both unmanaged and all these hardwood stands tends to be the dominant species, right? So this is your chestnut oak, right? In our longleaf stands that have been herbicided and burned, right? We have bumped up that that level of pine, right, substantially over the unmanaged, right? So we've gained an increased abundance. These are importance values here of both longleaf as well as shortleaf. So I guess I should have mentioned earlier on that these stands aren't just dominated by longleaf. These are not pure longleaf pine stands by any stretch of the imagination. We expect a significant proportion of shortleaf pine to occur in these stands as well. So we're starting to get changes here, and this is just in 10 years, in the direction that we expect. In terms of just burning effect on hardwoods, I want you to look at burn hardwoods versus unmanaged hardwoods, and geez, we don't see much change at all, right? So not a whole lot of effect of strictly just burning versus non-burning. In fact, some of these oaks that we have here may actually benefit to some degree from burning, some of the species in here. And then finally, over here, the sack and squirt burned longleaf right here, we've reduced the amount of hardwoods that are present. So now it's dominated primarily by the 2 pine species, right? But I'm going to show you some data here showing all the other vegetative characteristics of this stand really haven't changed to the positive. Burning is an essential component to really changing the community to what you want it to be. In terms of effects on the longleaf pines themselves, this is a longleaf pine. I'm sorry, I'm going to go back. Just the distribution, 2004 in the white bars, you can see the size class distribution. And then we haven't changed it a whole lot. We got sort of an increase here in the earlier classes. As trees age, we got an increase in the older or larger classes. Otherwise, it hasn't changed the overall longleaf pine size distribution substantially. So that's actually a positive aspect of this. In terms of changes, now this is an ordination. Some of you may not be familiar with what an ordination is, but it basically allows us to sort out study stands or plots based upon the overall tree community distribution. And this particular plot here shows trees on this side of the distribution that tend to be non-fire tolerant. And then on this side of the distribution, these are tree species that tend to be fire tolerant: the pinus, sweet gum, blackjack oak, sassafras, and so forth. All right. So basically this says that stands that end up on this side are similar because they share non-fire tolerant species, and stands that end up on this side are similar because they share fire tolerant species. So where do our stands fit in this? Now this is, again, a little bit complex to follow, but I'll show you just one stand as an example. So here is a particular stand in 2004 when we initiated this. This is the pre-management condition. Over here on this side of this distribution, along with all of these unmanaged stands and the hardwood stands. But over time, we've moved that stand. We've moved its tree community composition over here in this direction towards a composition that's more comprised of fire tolerant species. And not only that, it's now not that much different than the tree community distribution found in the Talladega National Forest sites and the Mount Longleaf Pine sites that are actually over here on the left side of this distribution. And you can see this change over time in all of these stands that we actually did management in. They've all moved in the direction. They've moved from right to left in this distribution, meaning they've moved substantially from non-fire tolerant to fire tolerant species, and they're getting closer to the reference stands. Well, one stand is kind of interesting because this stand kind of got a head start in 2004. It had a prior prescribed burn. So this thing, you know, it didn't need to move much. Got a head start by a previous. Importance values show the same thing. That was tree density that I just showed you. But once again, stands that contain primarily fire intolerant. These are some hickories and ash and poplar and that sort of thing on this side. And then fire tolerant species tend to be on this side. This is Quercus stellata, that's post oak. Fire tolerant hardwoods and pines over on this side. So you get the same kind of thing. Over time, these stands move and they change their overall tree community composition in the direction towards more fire tolerant species, and they get closer to the reference stands that we are trying to use as comparisons. So that just basically shows that that far into the process, we're getting the expected and hoped for tree community changes simply using some Hackett-Squirt herbiciding and prescribed burning. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about fuels, down woody fuels and herbaceous plants and grasses and so forth. And we use a complex method to assess a bunch of different things at a single sample point. So I'll just show you what these are as we go along. But you know, small trees, shrubs, herbaceous plants, grasses, litter, duff, various classes of down woody fuels. Again, we're going to just compare a certain set of stands here. We're going to basically compare unmanaged longleaf stands with managed longleaf stands. So these stands here are the managed longleaf stands with the Hackett-Squirt and burning, right? And then the unmanaged stands that are simply left. They're not treated in any ways. The management is to protect them, fire suppression. Right? So in these figures that I'm going to show you, they're all pretty similar, but we have the various stands arrayed across this axis, and then these are the various fuels. This is 1 hour, 10 hour, 100 hour, and 1000 hour down woody fuels. And we have the dark bars being the managed stands, including our reference stands, and then the light colored bars being the unmanaged stands, and then the gray bar being that one stand that was simply herbicided and wasn't burned, right? So in all of these cases, we have a pretty good segregation where we have our herbicided and burned stands nesting with our reference stand, as we had hoped for the most part. And the stand that was only herbicided and not burned, nesting with our unmanaged stands in most of these characteristics, not all of them, but most of them, right? So this again is suggesting that it's the obvious, right? Prescribed burning not only burns fuels, it creates fuels, but creates different kinds of fuels as you know, burns are conducted, and then there's an interval of accumulation of fuels that occur between burns, right? So this is like 2 years, these are data that are sort of two years after the previous prescribed burn. So again, you get a similar thing for some of these other fuels. This is 1000 hour rotten down woody fuels. This is rotted large stuff, right? And again, our stands that are being managed are nesting right with where we expect. This is the Talladega National Forest site. And then the one that is not burned, but herbicided only, nesting with unmanaged stands. Duff in particular is really substantial. You know, this amount of duff in these unmanaged stands continues to be a particular issue. Small trees, we did some small tree assays as well. And this one, we don't have the data on small trees for the Talladega National Forest sites or the Mount Longleaf sites, but here we have a really pretty clear distinction between our managed and unmanaged stands in small trees, living shrubs, and dead shrubs. So we're getting an increase in the abundance, not necessarily the height. We didn't calculate heights of these. I could do that, but I didn't. But we're increasing the abundance of things that are in the understory. Now, some of these small trees are indeed hardwoods and other pine species other than longleaf. There's loblolly and shortleaf and Virginia pine in here as well, but those are taken care of with subsequent burns, right? So that eventually you're gonna settle out. Very quickly, we can ordinate fuels again and do a similar comparison. This is, again, a scatter plot that is very similar to what I showed for tree species, where plots on this side of this diagram are high in 1 hour fuels and litter and duff. Plots that are on this side are higher in herbs, grasses, dead shrubs, large classes of fuels. And I'm just going to switch right over here and show you this diagram that kind of sorts these stands out. Over on this side are all the unmanaged stands, or our managed stands, our hack, squirt, and burn stands prior to management. In this little zone here are our stands after a single prescribed burn. And then scattered out in this direction are all our stands after 3 to 4 burns plus the herbicide application. And once again, what we've seen is we've moved the overall fuel characteristics, that's all those classes of fuels, just all together. The fuel characteristics have moved in the direction of our reference stand, right? So these stands here would nest more directly with our RCW stand that we're sort of as a target right there. So longleaf pine seedlings have increased as well. Just very quickly here to end up, we have only recruitment of longleaf pine seedlings in our managed stands. We do have a substantial recruitment of other pine species, but again, that's primarily loblolly, Virginia pine, and shortleaf pine. All right, and with continued prescribed burning, lobs and Virginia pine would tend to fall out of this, and we think the long term would be to maintain dominance by longleaf and shortleaf. Very quickly, just to summarize some other early results, we have a substantial increase in herbaceous understory diversity, going from about 14 species that we could find in unmanaged stands to nearly 10 times that much in our managed stands. The bird diversity, we have a paper out showing the increase in abundances of birds and a shift in the community structure, the kinds of birds that were found there, and a similar increase in reptile amphibian diversity, moving from about 6 species in unmanaged areas to 15 species. So these are the ancillary effects on other species other than longleaf pine that we were talking about, that we had hoped for in this work. So just to summarize, a lot of people to thank here, but you know, we haven't been able to do substantial prescribed burning for quite some time, and it's been maybe 4 years since we've been able to do the last prescribed burn, and we're really, really looking forward to being able to do this. We had about 120 acres ready to go, getting ready to go for this spring, and COVID hit, and darn it, you know, it really knocked us back. So we're really hoping that we can pick up, maybe even do some growing season burns this summer, if we can actually pull that off. If nothing less, begin some prescribed burning again in the fall so that we can continue this, because the kind of changes that I'm talking about are only going to be maintained onto the future if we have a continued prescribed burning program. Again, there's a lot of people here. You can read over the names, but I just want to thank every one of you out there that have in any way helped us out in the past. And I very appreciate all the important support you've given this project over the years. So thank you very much. I'll take any questions.
Hey, Marty, thanks so much for your talk, and thanks for the great work that you've continued on since that first burn 25 years ago. I remember the most striking thing was at night seeing the burning fat lighter stumps like distributed across the mountain, and that's what longleaf used to be, you know?
Yeah,
all those stuff.
Yeah, that was pretty impressive, and you know, those stumps burned 4 or 5 feet deep, and they were a menace for a good number of years. They're all filled in now. And in their place, we have longleaf that are 10, 15 feet tall, right?
Awesome. We do have a few questions for you, a couple ecological questions and management. First, were any of the surrounding areas adjacent to the mountain longleaf stands historically an oak savanna? Talk about that a little bit.
You know, I haven't read anything like that. There are some really interesting open areas in certain areas of the campus. And they usually occur in between the ridges. There's these interesting glade-like things that are occurring in between these finger ridges that come out of the side. And that's been an interesting habitat that the Georgia Plant Conservation Alliance has been interested in. They've made some visits up there. I don't know for certain about the tree canopy composition there, but I suspect it's primarily hickories, probably Caryoptomentosa, mockernut hickory probably is the dominant, and pale hickory as well. But I don't know for sure about the tree community composition in those little spots.
Okay. We got a question about the montane longleaf ecosystem. They say great talk, by the way. How do you typically define the montane longleaf? Is it elevation, soils, understory community? Is it truly only in Northeast Georgia and Northeast Alabama? And aside from Moore's maps, do you have any suggested references on that?
So, Sargent produced some maps as well. Sargent produced some maps that showed, once again, it was looking at commercial levels of available longleaf. And he indicated areas where longleaf had already been removed. So the entire Coosa Valley area. So it went down to the rivers in these locations. But I guess you probably know, Shannon, that we've had some mountain longleaf conferences in the past, and we debated the issue of how do you define mountain longleaf. And we're basically defining it primarily as regional, right? So that particular region that is above the fall line in northeast Alabama, northwest Georgia, where historical records and relic trees can be found, that's generally what we're referring to as mountain longleaf habitats. The further north you get, the more restricted that habitat gets to south and southwest facing slopes. You know, on Lavender Mountain, for example, it's almost as if, God took a spray can and aimed it from the southwest and sprayed longleaf on the slopes. That's kind of how it is. And I think that has to do with fire frequency. I think this all has to do with fire frequency because, Native Americans were very active in this region. This is part of the tragic Trail of Tears locations, but Cherokee and previous Native Americans were in here, as well as the, people that came in after the 1830s were still using fire quite a bit. So I think those dry slopes, sunny slopes, burn more frequently, and as a result, they became dominated more with longleaf.
And then a question about herb diversity. Do you think it came from the seed bank, from immigration of propagules, or from sprouting?
So there are some, roads and so forth, and sort of refugia for living plants that, throughout that area. That's certainly one possible source. But I think a lot of it came from the seed bank. Yeah.
Cool. And then can you talk a little bit more about growing season burning and what the difference is in plant diversity between winter and summer burning?
Well, we've never done summer burning here on the campus. We've always, followed the regulation that stopped burning. We've recently recognized that summer burns are actually a possibility in terms of prescribed burning. We should be able to get permits to do prescribed burning in our county. So that's actually was a new revelation to me. The one thing I know about the summer burns is that, the grasses here are the blue stem type grasses, right? And some others like, Hippodocedum, the black-seeded, I can't think of the name of it now, but needlegrass, that's a common grass. They don't require these growing season burns in order to set flower, right, and set seed like wiregrass does. So, because of that, I hadn't really thought much about growing season burns, but I suspect that it would help to achieve hardwood control much more quickly than strictly non-growing season burns, where I know they've had some trouble here in just north of us, where the northern mountain longleaf pine stands are just north of us in the Chattahoochee-Oconee National Forest. They haven't been able to achieve good hardwood control strictly with prescribed burning. And again, you doing it almost exclusively.
2 minutes.
Yeah, okay. And doing that almost exclusively as winter burns.
Okay. I just want to make a point. If we don't answer your question, we will compile them and get back with you after the talk. So it looks like we have a few more questions. I'll just do one more, Marty, and then let you go. Someone was curious why you did the herbicide to remove the trees rather than cut and haul. Was it less disturbance on the understory and soil? Was it less active? And curious about how the standing trees, dead trees did fall.
See that arm? That's the slopes we're talking about.
Right.
So we're not getting up there. We're not getting up there with equipment and removing trees. We also we didn't know what we were doing to begin with, to be completely honest, and we didn't want to create a really dramatic change all of a sudden. So that herbiciding actually took place across 3 years, where we removed the first 50%, then the next 50%, and the final sort of mop-up herbiciding to get the rest of them. So we actually did it across 3 years. Students
So I'm imagining the standing dead was not an issue during subsequent prescribed fires.
It was along the edges. It was along the fire breaks, and
Right.
So that actually caused us some consternation, and we had to ultimately consume that fuel. But as long as it was well within the fire breaks, that's no problem at all. It can
Well,
be
thanks,
associated, just one final point there. It can be associated with igniting that duff. If you have a log burning for a long period of time, you know, that can ignite duff. So that was another source of problem from the fallen dead.
Right, right, exactly. And I've got an awesome thing that I call the Duff Buster 3000. I will share a poster with you guys on a way to find duff fires and put them out very efficiently and economically. So we'll send that out to people. But I think we're ready to move on to our next speaker.
Thank you, everyone.